She moved through Oak Creek Memorial like she was made of the walls themselves, part of the hospital's infrastructure, necessary but invisible. Laura Bennett's scrubs were always pressed, creases sharp enough to cut, and her badge hung at exactly the same angle every shift, never crooked, never drawing attention. 3 years of this. 3 years of arriving 30 minutes early and leaving 60 minutes late, clocking out unpaid, moving between rooms with the kind of careful economy of motion that came from something the intake forms never asked about. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn overhead, casting everything in the particular exhaustion that only hospitals knew. She checked her locker in the break room at 6:08 a.m., the small metal door opening to reveal her shift bag and, wrapped in tissue paper at the very back, a faded unit patch. It had been sewn into the lining of an old field jacket, the jacket she kept but never wore, buried under the winter clothes she didn't need in Savannah. Her fingers found the patch without looking. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, stitched in fading thread. She ran her thumb across it once, the way a rosary bead gets worn smooth from prayer, and closed the locker. Her reflection in the metal showed what she'd spent 3 years perfecting, a woman who could disappear in plain sight. The slight limp was barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. The way she held her left shoulder higher, that could just be posture. The thin white line along her collarbone could have come from anything. The scars on her hands, always covered by long sleeves even in the Georgia heat, belonged to someone else. Someone from before. Oak Creek Memorial sat on the corner of Victory Drive and East 49th Street, a 7-story brick building that had been piecing together Savannah's broken people for 42 years. The ICU occupied most of the 3rd floor, and that was Laura's world. 12 beds. 12 stories that nobody got to know about, because she kept them private the same way she kept everything private. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. The heart monitors beat their steady count. The 4 pumps chimed when something needed attention. She knew every sound, every rhythm, every tell. She knew which patients would code and which would stabilize, the way her body just knew how to move through a procedure, hand steady as surgical instruments, muscle memory from somewhere the other nurses didn't have. The morning shift began at 7. Laura had already changed the linens in 3 rooms, checked the medication schedules, and reviewed overnight notes before the day shift started filtering in. Jessica, one of the newer nurses, arrived at 7:15 looking exhausted, 2nd pregnancy, 3rd shift in a row. Laura had already prepared her assignment, the lighter cases, knowing Jessica's feet would hurt by noon. Nobody asked her to. Nobody thanked her for it. That was how it worked. You helped, or you didn't. You stayed invisible, or you became a problem. At 7:23 a.m., the doors to the administrative wing opened and Dr. Kenneth Hargrove walked into Oak Creek Memorial for the first time as Chief of Medical Staff. His shoes were Italian leather, the color of aged brandy, with a sole that hadn't touched a hospital floor in maybe 3 years. His suit was tailored in that particular way that announced every dollar of its price, dark blue, probably $4,000, maybe $5,000. He wore a watch that caught the fluorescent light like it was catching fire, and when he smiled at the receptionist, there were too many teeth in it. He was the kind of man who measured value the way art dealers measured paintings, by how much money had exchanged hands. He moved through the hospital like he was cataloging it for sale, checking charts without reading them fully, nodding at staff without making eye contact, already making notes on a small leather tablet about what he'd reorganize, who he'd replace, what corners could be cut to improve the bottom line. His eyes passed over Laura twice on that first morning, once when she was adjusting a patient's for drip, once when she was documenting vitals, and registered her the way you register beige paint on a waiting room wall. Functional. Unremarkable. Disposable. What Dr. Hargrove didn't see was that Laura's for placements were flawless, one stick, every time, even on the most difficult veins. What he didn't see was the way patients calmed when she entered a room, the way the panic in their eyes would settle like she'd thrown a blanket over them. What he didn't see was that she'd already saved 3 lives in the 3 years she'd worked at Oak Creek Memorial, all of them quiet saves, all of them undocumented in any official sense because she'd simply been where she needed to be when the body started failing. By her second day of watching Dr. Hargrove, Laura understood his power structure. He'd come from Beaumont Memorial in Houston, where he'd apparently cleaned house, restructured departments, eliminated what he called overhead positions, and managed to make the hospital's profit margin look like the kind of number that got you promoted. He had connections, the kind of connections that came with a country club membership and golf outings with hospital board members. He'd already had lunch with 3 of them, and Laura knew this because she'd overheard him on his phone in the break room, talking about handicaps and weekend plans at Bacon Park Golf Club. His power wasn't in his medical knowledge, which seemed adequate but uninspired. His power was in the fact that people like him didn't get questioned. People like him got away with things because they'd learned early that the system was built for people like him. The ICU census had been running at 87%. Staffing had been adequate because people like Laura worked the hours that made it possible. But Dr. Hargrove looked at the staffing model and saw an opportunity. If you could get the same outcomes with fewer nurses, that was money in the system. Never mind that the same outcomes often came because of the people who stayed late, who didn't clock in for the extra work, who moved like ghosts through the night shift and caught the problems before they became crises. On Wednesday of Hargrove's first week, the paramedics brought Marcus Chen through the trauma bay doors at 11:04 a.m., and everything that had been quiet in Laura's world suddenly became impossible to ignore. The ambulance siren had wailed down Victory Drive like a warning nobody heeded, and the team was waiting. Code Yellow, Priority Trauma. The paramedic, a woman named Rodriguez who'd done this run 100 times, gave her report in the clipped precision that came from knowing every second mattered. Army Ranger, training accident, approximately 90 minutes ago, spinal injury, bilateral lower extremity paralysis confirmed, C-spine stabilized, vital stable, conscious and oriented, pain level 7 out of 10. Marcus Chen was 34 years old and had the kind of face that still looked young until you noticed the eyes. Those eyes had seen something that Savannah, Georgia hadn't been built to hold. He came through the doors on a stretcher, and his wife, a woman with dark hair and the particular exhaustion of someone who'd just watched their world break, walked alongside him, her hand gripping his shoulder, her jaw clenched like she was holding everything together through sheer force of will. Laura was in the ICU when he came up from trauma. She wasn't scheduled to be his nurse, Jessica had drawn that assignment, but information moved through the hospital the way rumors moved through small towns. She heard the name. Marcus Chen. Army Ranger. Spinal injury. She didn't react. She finished documenting the medication administration for her current patient, made a note about the patient's urine output and color, and moved on to the next room. But her hands knew something her face didn't show. Her heart rate did something it shouldn't have done. Because she knew that name. She knew it the way you know a name when it's been attached to prayers you said in a tent in Helmand Province, prayers you made to a god you'd stop believing in because if he existed, he wouldn't let soldiers like Marcus Chen have to come home broken. She knew that name because her son David had said it every time he called home from deployment. Colonel Chen's looking out for us. Chen saved Rodriguez's life in Sanjin Valley. Chen's got his whole team's back, he's the kind of officer who'd die for you. She knew that name because when her son came home the second time, the first thing he'd done was drive to Walter Reed and spend 3 days sitting with a young officer who'd been hit in Loga Province, because that officer had been in Chen's unit. Laura Bennett was a senior chief petty officer, retired, and the military code was embedded in her bones like shrapnel that never gets removed. You didn't advertise your connection to the chain of command. You didn't pull rank. You didn't use your past as a credential when you'd spent 3 years trying to bury it. You showed up. You did the work. You held people together when they were falling apart. You asked for nothing and expected nothing. That was the code, and it was the only thing she'd held onto when everything else from before started trying to kill her. So when Marcus Chen's wife, Sarah, stepped out of the trauma bay and looked up at the hospital's white ceiling like she was trying to find God somewhere in the acoustic tiles, Laura simply existed in the space nearby, close enough to be useful if something went wrong, invisible enough that nobody would notice she was watching. She'd spent 3 years perfecting this particular skill. Being there without being there. Saving people without letting them know they were being saved. The medical monitor beeped its steady rhythm from down the hall. The 4 pump chimed. The ventilators wheezed. And Laura Bennett, who'd once held a radio in the dark and called in air support, who'd carried a Marine named Garrett Torres with 2 shattered legs across 4 kilometers of hostile territory because he'd been her swim buddy and that was what you did, who'd earned the kind of medals that got locked in storage units because she couldn't stand to look at them anymore, simply continued her shift, moving invisible through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial like she'd been made of them all along. But that wasn't the worst part of what was about to happen. Dr. Hargrove moved through the hallways of Oak Creek Memorial like a man testing the weight of his own authority, and what he'd seen in room 412 had cracked something in his carefully ordered world. A nurse teaching a patient. Unauthorized. Unscripted. Operating as though she had medical credentials she didn't possess. He arrived at the door at 3:19 p.m. on a Tuesday, his white coat pressed sharp enough to cut, his voice calibrated to carry. Laura was showing Mrs. Chen the proper angle for passive range of motion exercises, slow, deliberate movements to prevent the muscle contractures that would lock Marcus Chen's paralyzed shoulders into permanent rigidity. She'd done this exact demonstration 17 times in the past 4 days, each session unpaid, each one extending her shift by 20 minutes she wouldn't bill for. The Army Ranger lay on the bed with the weight of his own immobilized body, his wife learning how to hold his arm at the shoulder, how to rotate slowly through the joint, how to understand that this simple motion was the difference between mobility and permanent frozen pain. Nurse Bennett. Hargrove's voice cut across the room like a blade through silk. A word. Laura's hand stilled mid-demonstration. She looked at Marcus Chen's face, saw the slight tightening at his jaw, the recognition of rank structure and challenge. She'd seen that exact expression on David's face when superior officers entered a room with confrontation already loaded in their posture. She set Mrs. Chen's arm gently down on the bed and stepped back, turning to face Hargrove with the neutral expression of someone who'd learned long ago that showing reaction only fed the hunger. Of course, Doctor. 8 words. Calm. Measured. Empty of inflection. You are not a physical therapist. Hargrove's voice rose, loud enough that nurses at the station 3 rooms away would hear every word. You are not authorized to provide rehabilitative instruction. What you're doing here is practicing outside your scope of practice, and frankly, it exposes this hospital to significant legal liability. Laura took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned in Helmand Province, the kind that came before you made a decision that couldn't be unmade. I was showing Mrs. Chen how to prevent contractures, Doctor. Basic nursing care. Range of motion exercises are standard nursing protocol for paralyzed patients. What you were doing, Hargrove said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a register that somehow sounded louder, is practicing outside your scope because you think you know better than the physicians who actually went to medical school. Playing therapist. Playing doctor. This ends now, Nightingale. No more of this. You stick to vitals and medications and keeping your hands off my patient's rehabilitation. The nickname hung in the air like poison gas, Nightingale, Florence Nightingale, the implication that Laura was some amateur nurse playing at care, a historical figure rather than a current professional. He'd been waiting to use it. Laura understood that immediately. The humiliation required a name. The name required an audience. Mrs. Chen's hands had begun to tremble. She was staring at her husband, tears forming in the corners of her eyes, the shame of being part of something that was supposedly wrong wrapping around her shoulders like a cold cloth. Marcus Chen was staring at the ceiling, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like rope beneath his skin. He couldn't move. He couldn't defend his wife or himself or the woman who'd spent for days teaching them both how to navigate the prison of his own body. Laura met Hargrove's eyes without blinking. She didn't look away. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain or defend or defer. She simply stood there, meeting his gaze with the flat calm of someone who'd already survived worse than words, and one tear, just one, the kind that couldn't be stopped through sheer will, escaped down her left cheek. She wiped it away with steady fingers, the motion deliberate and controlled, then looked directly at him. You've made your position clear, Doctor. Not an apology. Not a promise to stop. A statement of fact delivered in a voice so quiet it required the entire room to go silent to hear it. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Hargrove nodded, satisfied, and walked out of the room as though he'd accomplished something. Behind him, Mrs. Chen was crying silently, and Marcus Chen was staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man watching his powerlessness crystallize into permanent form. Laura helped Mrs. Chen into the hallway and toward the visitors' lounge, speaking in the kind, practical voice that said nothing about what had just happened. "Your husband needs rest now. Come back after dinner." She didn't touch her, didn't offer comfort beyond presence. Sometimes presence was all anyone could give. She returned to room for 12 and checked Chen's vitals, blood pressure elevated, heart rate tachycardic at 104, the physical evidence of rage and helplessness written across the monitor. She didn't speak. She simply adjusted his pillows and left him to process the wreckage. 30 minutes later, Laura entered the break room on the 3rd floor. 3 nurses, Sarah, who'd been working nights for 8 years, Jennifer, who'd trained with Laura on the cardiac floor, and a newer nurse named Marcus who'd borrowed money from Laura's locker a month ago when his daughter got sick, grabbed their coffee cups almost in unison. They didn't meet her eyes. One of them whispered to another, words too quiet to hear but loud enough to carry the intention. They left without a word, the door closing with the sound of judgment rendered silently but absolutely final. Laura sat at the table alone. She opened the lunch container she'd brought, leftover rice and vegetables she'd prepared that morning, and didn't eat it. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing remained steady. She simply sat and looked at the food as though it belonged to someone else, some other version of herself who still belonged to this place, this shift, this life she'd built out of careful invisibility. The break room fluorescent light hummed above her, the sound steady and mechanical, the sound of a place that didn't care who sat beneath it. After 12 minutes, she closed the container and left. No one else came into the break room that shift. By afternoon, a formal disciplinary notice had appeared on the unit board near the nurses' station, the bulletin board where schedule changes were posted, where patient census numbers were updated, where every staff member passed multiple times per shift. The paper was white with Hargrove's signature at the bottom in blue ink, official and indelible. Disciplinary action, notice of unsatisfactory conduct. Employee, L. Bennett, RN. Date of incident, October 16, 2024. Infraction, unauthorized patient instruction, boundary violations, failure to respect physician authority, practicing outside scope of nursing practice. This notice serves as formal documentation of performance deficiency. Further incidents will result in escalation of disciplinary measures. Acknowledge receipt below. There was a line for her signature. A line that said she understood. A line that made the humiliation official and documented, no longer a matter of words but a matter of record. Laura stood before it as one tear escaped, the kind of tear that came from somewhere deeper than the surface, from the place where 3 years of careful invisibility had started to develop cracks. She wiped it away with steady fingers, then stepped back and turned to find Hargrove standing 10 feet away, watching from near the medication dispensary, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The smile of a man who'd learned that power wasn't demonstrated through volume but through documentation, through the slow accumulation of official mechanisms that made resistance look like insubordination and dignity look like defiance. She didn't return the smile. She didn't acknowledge him at all. She simply walked back to the nurses' station and began charting her notes for the shift, her hands moving with the same steady competence they always did, as though the world hadn't shifted its weight and everything beneath her feet hadn't begun to crack. But that wasn't the worst part of what was about to unfold. The phone call happened at 3:14 a.m., while the rest of Oak Creek Memorial slept through its quietest hours. Dr. Hargrove sat in his office on the 4th floor, the desk lamp casting his shadow long across mahogany that cost more than most nurses made in a year, and he dialed the number he'd memorized from the hospital board directory, not the hospital line, but the personal cell of Richard Bancroft, the board president, the man who'd approved Hargrove's contract and who played 18 holes with him every other Saturday at Forsyth Country Club. The phone rang twice before Bancroft answered, his voice thick with interrupted sleep. "It's Hargrove. We have a situation. One of the nursing staff, Laura Bennett, works the cardiac unit. She's exhibiting increasingly unstable behavior. Boundary violations with a high-profile patient, refusing to respect scope of practice, and I'm concerned about patient safety. I think we need to bring in outside investigators. Quietly. Before this becomes a liability issue. He paused, letting the word liability sit like a stone in still water. Her references need to be flagged. I'd like external auditors to review her credentials thoroughly. Personnel files suggest some inconsistencies. There was a silence on the other end. Then Bancroft's voice, sharper now, awake. How serious? Serious enough that we need documentation. She's a risk to the hospital's reputation and our standing. I'd recommend moving quickly. By 6:36 a.m., before the day shift arrived, 3 independent investigators from Pinnacle Healthcare Compliance had been contracted, the kind of firm that specialized in credential reviews and quietly buried findings in redacted reports. They arrived mid-morning with clipboards and legal pads, moving through the hospital with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this 100 times. They didn't look at Laura directly when she passed them in the corridor. They didn't need to. By noon, they had her contact information from her original application. By 1:44 p.m., they were making calls. The first call went to St. Michael's Hospital in Jacksonville, where the reference form listed a supervisor from 5 years prior. Yes, I remember Laura Bennett, the voice on the other end said, hesitant. Why are you asking? The investigator, a woman named Patricia Chen with a voice like polished steel, explained the nature of the inquiry without explaining anything at all. Just asking questions. Did you ever observe behavioral concerns? Any incidents that made you question her stability? The supervisor's answers were careful, measured, honest. She was an excellent nurse. Quiet. Very competent. I never had a concern about her judgment. But the way Patricia Chen phrased her follow-up questions, never? Not even one moment that gave you pause. Was designed to make people second-guess their own memories, to assume that if the hospital was asking, there must be something to find. By 3:24 p.m., the second call went to the VA Medical Center in San Diego, to a clinical director who'd worked with Laura 7 years prior. This time, the investigator was a man, voice like a tank idling in a garage. All patients and implication, we're doing a comprehensive review of Ms. Bennett's professional history. We're just trying to establish a timeline of any concerning behaviors you may have observed. The director hesitated. Like what? Anything you think might be relevant to a question of judgment or emotional stability. The director said nothing had ever concerned him. But he'd also never expected to get a call like this, and the uncertainty crept in. What if he was missing something? What if he'd overlooked something back then? Meanwhile, Hargrove had already been to lunch with the nursing director, Margaret Wu, slipping into the seat across from her at an upscale bistro 3 blocks from the hospital. The conversation started casual. How were things on the units? Any staffing concerns? Before he pivoted, his voice dropping into a register of confidential concern. Margaret, I wanted to speak with you about Laura Bennett before this goes further. I'm concerned about her judgment on the cardiac floor. The way she's been with our patient, crossing boundaries, making decisions outside her scope. I'm worried about liability exposure if something goes wrong. She seems unstable. Emotionally. I wonder if anyone's mentioned any concerning behavior to you. Anything that made you worry about her mental state. Margaret had known Laura for 3 years. Laura came in on time, did her work without complaint, never asked for special treatment. But the way Hargrove was framing it, if something goes wrong, liability, made it sound like something had already gone wrong in his assessment, and Margaret's mind began to work backward, trying to find something she'd missed. Had Laura seemed distant? Withdrawn? Was that withdrawal a sign of instability, or just introversion? By the time she left that lunch, Margaret had convinced herself that Laura needed closer supervision, that perhaps Hargrove was seeing something she'd been too trusting to notice. The room went dead silent the moment Laura walked into the break room that afternoon and saw the 3 investigators sitting at the table with her personnel file open before them. They looked up. One of them, Patricia Chen, gestured to a chair. Ms. Bennett. We're conducting a routine credential review. Do you have 15 minutes? Laura sat down. She didn't ask what they were looking for. She already knew. The questions came in a specific order: inconsistencies in your application history, gaps in employment, any mental health counseling you've received, any incidents during previous employment you think we should know about, any reason you left the Navy. That particular question lingered in the air like smoke. Honorable discharge, Laura said quietly. Personal reasons. Can you elaborate on those reasons? No. The investigators exchanged a look. The look of people who'd just gotten the answer they were fishing for. Refusal to explain looks like evasion, and evasion looks like something to hide. They made notes. They didn't accuse her of anything. They didn't need to. The implication was the weapon, and it was already in the room with her, breathing. By 5:38 p.m., Hargrove had his first report from external investigators. Credential review shows discrepancies in stated experience and timeline gaps suggesting possible employment instability. References indicate inconsistent characterization. Subject deflected when asked about reason for military separation. Recommend full background investigation before proceeding. The language was clinical and vague, but the conclusion was clear: something didn't add up about Laura Bennett. That was when the rain started. At 6:22 p.m., Laura turned in her resignation verbally to Margaret Wu, who looked stricken. Laura, what's happening? What's going on? But Laura was already pulling off her badge, her ID card, the symbols of her temporary visibility in this world. She didn't explain. She packed her cardboard box, the coffee mug with the faded lighthouse, the dying succulent from a co-worker's get-well gift 3 years ago, the laminated photo of her swim buddy who didn't make it back from Helmand Province, the shift note she'd kept, the handwritten thank you from a family whose father she'd sat with during his final hours. The small archaeology of a life lived in the margins. By 7:15 p.m., the rain had become serious, the kind of rain that hammered the pavement like applause, thick and angry and relentless. Laura stood at the bus stop on Victory Drive with her cardboard box balanced against her hip, the water streaming down her face, her scrub soaked through to her skin, and she watched the rain accumulate in the cracks of the sidewalk. 37 years old. 23 years since she'd signed up, wanting to be useful, wanting to be part of something larger than herself. 12 years since the last deployment. 7 years since she'd started working at Oak Creek Memorial under a name that was hers but felt borrowed, building a life that was small enough to be invisible. And now the rain was washing it away. She thought about Marcus Chen lying in the hospital bed, his body broken but his mind sharp, his wife sitting vigil beside him. She thought about the moment she'd recognized his voice in the hallway, that particular way he said that meant he'd seen combat and lived through it. She thought about her son David, who'd been alive because of men like Marcus Chen, and the way she'd kept that secret to herself, locked it down, invisible. The bus pulled up. She didn't get on. She stood there with the rain drumming on the cardboard box, watching the people inside the lit windows moving through their evening routines, unaware of anything. She'd been standing in those windows for 7 years, invisible like that, and it had worked until it didn't. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd just abandoned the one patient who actually needed her, and the only person standing between him and a doctor who didn't know how to save him was Dr. Hargrove and his voicemail calls to the pulmonary staff. The phone in her pocket buzzed. A text from Margaret Wu, "Where are you?" Chen's monitor went off an hour ago and nobody can find his file. The text continued, "Hargrove told us to call him but he's not answering." Laura stood in the rain, the cardboard box becoming heavier, the photo of her swim buddy getting wet, and for the first time in 7 years, she let the invisible woman step aside. The text arrived at 2:33 a.m. A single message on the burner phone she kept in her locker, the one only her son David ever used. "Mom. Chen's crashing. Hargrove told us to call him but he's not answering." Laura stood in the rain, the cardboard box becoming heavier, the photo of her swim buddy getting wet, and for the first time in 7 years, she let the invisible woman step aside. She moved back through the emergency entrance like muscle memory taking over. The night shift was skeleton crew, 2 nurses for the ICU, 1 resident who was new enough to still look scared of his own shadow, and Hargrove nowhere to be found. The monitor in room for 12 was screaming. One long continuous alarm that meant Chen's oxygen saturation was dropping faster than gravity. The assigned nurse, a second-year named Patterson, stood at the station scrolling through her phone. "Room for 12, Laura said. Patterson didn't even look up. Hargrove said not to respond until he authorizes it. Laura was already moving. She didn't remember running, just the hallway stretching beneath her feet, the fluorescent lights blurring like tracer fire, and then the room. The cold air. The machines. And Marcus Chen turning the color of cyanide. His face was dusky. His paralyzed chest wasn't fighting anymore, couldn't fight. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against his heart with the relentless pressure of a fist slowly closing. His oxygen sat at 68. Then 64. The monitor's rhythm still holding, barely, like a soldier standing on one leg. She moved like a woman who had done this in a Black Hawk under enemy fire, with rounds snapping through the fuselage and a Marine's lung collapsing as the aircraft dove for altitude. The muscle memory didn't ask permission. Her hands reached for the angiocath needle in the crash cart. 14 gauge. Titanium sharp. She tore open Chen's gown at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and her voice was a flat command, "I need a witness. Someone. Now." The new resident appeared in the doorway, face pale. Patterson followed, finally moving. "Watch," Laura said. "Document." The needle went in with a whisper of displaced air. The hiss came next, that exact sound she remembered, the pressurized lung deflating like a breath finally released. The monitor changed. O2 sat jumped. 72. 80. 88. Chen's face began returning to human color. His eyes flickered open, wet with panic that was already transforming into something else. Relief. Recognition. The knowledge that someone had understood the language his body was speaking when no one else had been listening. "You're breathing now," Laura said quietly. "You're going to be fine." Chen's mouth formed a single word. "Mom." She didn't respond. She turned to the resident with steady hands and the kind of voice that didn't ask questions. "Get me a chest tube kit. Get me a portable X-ray. I need a blood gas in 5 minutes and a CT chest when radiology stops sleeping. Move." The resident moved. Patterson was still frozen, mouth open. Laura looked at her. One raised eyebrow. That was all. Patterson left to make the calls. Laura documented everything in Chen's chart with handwriting so precise it could have been typed. Time of procedure. Indication. Technique. Response. O2 saturation trajectory. Her own signature neat as a morgue tag. Professional. Authoritative. The signature of someone who had done this 1,000 times in a context where lives depended on perfect documentation. Then she saw him. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway, his face the color of old surgical gauze. His eyes moved from Chen's monitor, now reading normal sinus rhythm at 92 beats per minute, to the equipment on the bed, to the needle she was still holding, to Laura. The moment stretched like a held breath. He didn't speak. He turned and walked back down the hallway, and Laura knew with the certainty of someone who had read hostile intent across hostile terrain that she had just crossed a line he would not forgive. The phone call came from his office at 3:15 a.m. She heard about it from the nursing director 6 hours later. Hargrove's voice on a recorded line to the board president, a man named Sterling who owned a country club membership and 3 vacation homes. "We have a nurse who just performed an invasive surgical procedure without physician authorization. Emergency needle decompression. No order. No standing protocol. Direct violation of scope of practice. I need an emergency termination approved before she does something else that exposes this hospital to liability." The board president's response took less than 90 seconds. By morning, the machinery was already moving with the precision of something oiled and ready to run. Investigators from a consulting firm Hargrove had pre-contracted arrived with briefcases and expressions that suggested they had done this before. They moved through the hospital like auditors, pulling charts, reviewing video, interviewing staff with the kind of questions that had already decided what the answers meant. Laura was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. She sat in the nursing director's office, a woman named Morrison who had hired her 7 years ago without asking questions about the gaps in her resume, and waited. "You saved his life," Morrison whispered. Her hands shook as she reviewed the termination paperwork. "Yes," Laura said. "And they're firing you for it." "I know," Laura said. The words came out measured, certain. "Did you think they wouldn't?" Morrison didn't answer. She just slid the papers across the desk and turned away. The IT specialist who pulled the security footage was a Marine Corps veteran named Rodriguez. 23 years old, 2 combat tours, a scar that split his left eyebrow where shrapnel had found him in Kandahar. He understood what was happening the moment Hargrove appeared at the server room door with a disk and instructions to copy the footage from Chen's room. Rodriguez burned it to disk, handed it over with a salute so casual it took Hargrove a moment to realize it was a salute. What Rodriguez didn't mention was the 3 backup copies he'd already made. What he didn't mention was flagging the original files as legally protected evidence. What he didn't mention was the screenshots he was taking right then, in real time, as Hargrove walked back to his office. An hour later, Rodriguez watched from the server room as Hargrove deleted the files. Watched him do it slowly, deliberately, systematically, purging the digital evidence of exactly what had happened in room 412. Rodriguez took a screenshot of each deletion. Timestamped everything. The law moves slower than hospitals do, but it moves. And sometimes a Marine Corps veteran is the only thing standing between the truth and a deleted folder. 36 hours after she saved Marcus Chen's life, Laura received her official termination notice. The language was precise and lawyered, practicing outside the scope of nursing practice. Failure to follow physician orders. Performing an authorized invasive procedure without standing protocol. The security guards arrived at her locker during day shift change, when every nurse on the floor would see her walk out. She packed slowly. The cracked mug she'd used for 3 years of 12-hour shifts. The dying succulent from the shelf above her locker, its leaves paper-thin and brown at the edges. The photo of her swim buddy in dress whites, the one who hadn't made it home from Kandahar. And from the inner lining of her old field jacket, the faded unit patch she had sewn there so many years ago that the threads had become part of the fabric itself. She carried it all in a cardboard box on her hip. The hallway seemed to stretch as she walked. 50 pairs of eyes. The new resident looked away. Patterson wouldn't meet her gaze. The charge nurse stood motionless at the station. And at his office window on the 2nd floor, Dr. Hargrove watched her leave with an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been the face of someone who had just realized he'd pushed something off a cliff without knowing how far down the ground was. The rain-soaked bus stop was 3 blocks away. Laura stood there in the dark, the cardboard box softening in the wet, the photo of her swim buddy running at the edges. Traffic hissed past on Victory Drive. Taillights blurred like distant explosions. She was 47 years old. She had spent 12 years as a senior chief petty officer. She had saved more lives than she could count. She had given everything she had to become invisible, to heal without being healed, to help without being helped. And now she was standing in the rain at a bus stop with everything she owned in a box that was falling apart. She wondered if she'd been wrong to think she could ever stop being a ghost. Then a pair of headlights cut through the rain from the opposite direction. Not a civilian car. The sound of heavy diesel engines downshifting. The distinct silhouette of 3 black SUVs and something larger behind them. Government vehicles. The kind that didn't pull into Savannah at 4 a.m. for routine purposes. The kind that pulled in when someone had made a phone call that mattered. The convoy didn't slow down as it passed. But in that moment before the taillights faded, Laura saw the marking on the door of the lead vehicle. A logo she hadn't seen in 7 years. A logo that meant someone, somewhere, had finally decided that the invisible woman needed to be seen. 3 black SUVs cut through the morning humidity of Savannah like sharks through warm water. Pentagon plates. The kind of vehicles that didn't take exits, they carved them. 48 hours. That's how long it took for someone to make a phone call that changed everything. The main entrance of Oak Creek Memorial had never seen a convoy before. Staff paused at windows. A nurse dropped a medication cup. The lobby's fluorescent lights hummed their neutral tune, indifferent to the fact that the world was about to realign. A Navy captain in dress white stepped out of the lead vehicle. Pressed uniform. Gold shoulder boards catching the southern sun like a weapon. He walked past the reception desk without checking in, his presence carrying the kind of authority that made people move out of his way before he had to ask. Behind him came 3 officers in full dress. Behind them, a woman in a charcoal suit carrying a leather portfolio that looked heavier than it should. "I'm looking for Senior Chief Bennett," the captain said. Not a question. A military call sign hanging in the air like a name that hadn't been spoken aloud in 3 years. Former Navy. Goes by a civilian name now. The receptionist's face went blank. She had no idea. Nobody at Oak Creek Memorial had any idea. The lobby doors opened again. David Bennett walked in wearing the dress blues of the United States Army, lieutenant's bars on his shoulders, the blue cord of the 75th Ranger Regiment on his chest, decorations that meant he'd survived things that didn't have names. He was Laura's son. He was also Marcus Chen's platoon leader. He was also the one who'd made the call that brought the Pentagon to Savannah. He walked straight to where the Navy captain stood and saluted with the precision of someone who'd done it under enemy fire. The captain returned it like a ritual between equals. "Lieutenant Bennett." The captain's voice was steady, measured. "Your mother." Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett served with distinction. David's voice didn't waver. Didn't apologize. Didn't ask permission. He said it loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, loud enough for the nurses emerging from the back corridors to stop mid-stride, loud enough for the administrator to look up from her desk with the expression of someone watching a vehicle crash in slow motion. A SEAL team leader stepped forward. His name was Commander Hayes, and he'd flown in from Virginia 6 hours after Marcus Chen made a phone call that changed the trajectory of federal investigation. Hayes had the kind of presence that made the hospital's sterile air feel insufficient, like the building's oxygen supply couldn't quite support someone who'd operated at his altitude. "Bronze Star with Valor," Hayes said, and his voice carried through the atrium like a ritual incantation. Each word its own sentence. "Purple Heart." Navy Commendation Medal for actions in Helmand Province that resulted in 12 Marines being extracted alive under fire. She was their commanding officer for a 3-week operation where the casualty rate should have been 100%. Instead, it was 0. The hospital administrator, the one who'd signed Laura's termination papers without looking at them, suddenly realized she was holding a personnel file with blank spaces where commendation should have been listed. Military honors that Laura had left empty on her employment application. Names of decoration she'd refused to mention. A woman who'd walked into Oak Creek Memorial as if she had nothing to offer except her hands and her competence. Dr. Hargrove emerged from the elevator at exactly the wrong moment. His expensive suit couldn't save him. His country club tan couldn't save him. His connection to the board president, a golfing buddy, a fellow believer in hierarchical power structures, couldn't save him. He went gray the way buildings go gray after a fire, drained of color, structural integrity compromised, the inside hollow. The commander locked eyes with him. Not a challenge. Worse than a challenge. Recognition. The kind of look that meant Hargrove was being catalogued, filed, understood as something less than what he'd pretended to be. "Rodriguez." The administrator's voice was thin. "Where's Rodriguez?" The Marine Corps IT specialist was already in the hospital's conference room with 2 state investigators and the hospital's legal counsel. Rodriguez didn't have a dramatic presence like the SEAL commander. Rodriguez had something more dangerous: evidence. He'd made 3 backup copies of every file Hargrove deleted. Screenshots of server access logs. Timestamps showing exactly when the security footage of Laura's needle decompression had been removed from the hospital's system. The 40 seconds of video that proved she'd saved a paralyzed man's life while a doctor fumbled with a phone. Dr. Hargrove personally deleted this footage, Rodriguez said, his Marine Corps uniform still pressed from his civilian job. He was IT specialist, but he'd been a data analyst in Iraq, and he knew how to present evidence like it was intelligence briefing. He accessed the security server at 14:37 on the day of the procedure. Deleted files related to Trauma Bay 3 at 14:41. Attempted another deletion at 18:22 when he realized the first deletion had been logged. I preserved everything. The legal team's faces shifted into a configuration that meant financial exposure. Massive exposure. The kind that made hospital administrators pray for quick retirement packages. The State Medical Board investigation moved with the speed of federal machinery engaging. Within 72 hours, Hargrove was suspended pending review. The charges were clinical and devastating, evidence tampering, interference with patient care, abuse of authority to retaliate against a subordinate employee. The board convened an emergency session. They watched the security footage Rodriguez had preserved, Laura's hands moving with the precision of muscle memory honed in a combat zone, the needle finding the precise anatomical landmark, the hiss of air escaping the tension pneumothorax, Chen's oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 94 in 40 seconds while Hargrove stood paralyzed with indecision. They watched Hargrove's calls to the consulting firm, the coordinated pressure campaign against Laura's references, the strategic maneuvers that would have been brilliant if they weren't also crimes. A board member who'd met Hargrove for golf last month looked sick. By the fourth week, the consequences had cascaded like a controlled demolition. Medical license revoked. Termination for cause, which meant no severance package, no lawsuit settlement, no quiet exit with a consulting position waiting in another city. The state board's decision was public record. Permanent. The consulting firm he'd retained quietly refunded its fees and began an internal review that would eventually result in a policy change about vetting hospital administrator clients. Country club memberships didn't require transparency. They cancelled themselves. Phone calls went unreturned. His wife's family money, the thing he'd always mentioned in conversations designed to establish his worth, became suddenly insufficient. Witnesses later reported seeing Dr. Hargrove at a folding table outside the public supermarket on Victory Drive, selling supplemental insurance policies. His expensive suits had been replaced by a company polo and a clip-on tie that hung at a slightly wrong angle. When a nurse from Oak Creek Memorial walked past on her afternoon break, he didn't make eye contact. His hands were steady, those hadn't changed, but they were holding pamphlets instead of prescriptions. Laura stood in the hospital parking lot, civilian clothes fitting her differently than Scrubs ever had. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was standing at attention, shoulders back, the posture of a woman who'd stopped pretending to be smaller than she was. Chen's wife approached, holding tissue-wrapped something. "This was in your locker. The staff found it after everything." She unwrapped a faded unit patch. The kind that gets sewn into the lining of a jacket and travels with you through wars, through healing, through the years where you pretend to be someone you're not. Laura had cut it from her old field jacket 7 years ago, carried it invisibly, a reminder of who she'd been in case she ever wanted to remember. "Thank you for saving him," Chen's wife said. "Thank you for not giving up." Laura's fingers found the patch, steady, certain. Her son David stood beside her in his army dress uniform. The Navy captain stood at attention. The SEAL commander stood like a man who'd seen people save other people under circumstances that didn't allow for hesitation. "The Pentagon wants to honor you properly," the captain said. "The ceremony you should have received. We're asking you to come to Washington." David stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of an officer speaking to a senior enlisted who'd outranked him in every way that mattered. "Mom. It's time to stop hiding. The world needs to see Lighthouse again." For the first time in 3 years, Laura Bennett stood at full military attention. Not the careful disappearance, not the quiet invisibility. Full attention. The posture of a senior chief petty officer. The commander saluted her. David saluted her. One by one, the sailors and soldiers in the parking lot formed up around her like a perimeter of recognition. Hospital staff watched from windows. The administrator had already drafted a formal apology and reinstatement offer that Laura would never accept. She didn't need redemption from Oak Creek Memorial. She needed the Pentagon to acknowledge what she'd always known, that some heroes don't wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, you know Laura's story. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more stories about the quiet warriors walking among us, the ones who heal with hands that have already saved lives in ways the world will never fully understand. Comment below, would you have saved him, or would you have waited for permission? Thanks for watching.